sit over here, just to make this look a bit more beautiful. I'm not being televised. Order, order. Can I welcome members of the public to this first evidence session for the committee's inquiry into the UK's response to extremism and political instability in North and West Africa. And I'm delighted to welcome our first two witnesses, Professor Paul Rogers, who is the Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University, and Mr. Imad Mesdoua. Have I got that pronunciation right? Mesdoua. Political analyst with Pasco Risk Management. Thank you both very much indeed for coming along. Is there anything you want to say by way of an opening statement? I've got a fairly general first question. But
just to thank you for inviting us here this afternoon.
My pleasure. Well, I mean, really, can I start the ball rolling by asking if Mali is a textbook example of good international intervention, or is the jury still out at the moment?
If I can start, I think it is very much the case that the jury is still out. I would be much happier being able to look back 5 years from the future. We're in the very early stages, I think, of what may develop in Mali and its relationship to surrounding areas. At the moment, it looks like there is some progress being made, but I think one has to be very cautious. In particular, we're coming into the hottest part of the year when traditionally there is much less movement. I think for that reason alone there may be something of a hiatus.
Well, I tend to agree with what the professor has just said. I think whether or not Mali will be seen as a success will depend to a large extent on how the elections will go in the month of July, and whether or not these elections are able to bring about free and fair choice for the people of Mali, and bring about legitimate institutions, but also to redefine the role of the military within Mali. And I think to really understand whether or not it was a success will depend on the long-term objectives that are set out for the development of Mali and Mali's political institutions, rather than just looking and focusing on the security agenda that's been looked at thus far.
Do you think we've underestimated the complexity of it?
I would certainly think so, yes. I mean, it's a combination of a number of different factors. The complexity of the ethnic makeups in northern Mali, the role particularly of the Tuareg, the relative roles of Islamist tendencies. I think the extent to which the Islamist elements last year became quite embedded, not just in the towns, but in some of the mountainous areas. And perhaps most worrying of all, the early evidence that there are paramilitary elements from other countries who've now been moving into Mali. The incident, I think, just 2 or 3 days ago, in which 4 Egyptians were killed, one quite well known, who have clearly been in Mali for some time. They were killed in an incident, and that suggests that one of the things we rather fear, that it might become a magnet for a wider group, quite apart from the Tuareg who've come across from Libya, may actually be coming to pass.
We'll probe that particular point shortly, particularly interesting.
Yes, I again tend to agree. We have underestimated the complexity of the situation in Mali. One of the errors I think that was made and that is currently being made is that we tend to view the crisis in Mali in the sole context of northern Mali, rather than looking at the broader regional implications. And also, we tend to look at it in a very specific and limited timeline. We tend to look at the events in Mali starting from the coup or the crisis in 2012, when really many of the problems that are facing the international community in Mali and elsewhere in the Sahel go far back. There are issues of borders, there are issues of smuggling, drug trafficking, but also of drought and famine, which go back decades. And the issue of the Tuareg, as the professor has rightly noted, is also an issue that goes back at least 30 to 40 years. So we have, to a certain extent, underestimated the complexity of the problems in Mali at the moment.
If the French hadn't intervened and the Islamic forces who were pushing south had actually taken Bamako, what do you think the impact would have been upon Britain's interests or the interests of Europe or the wider world?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that there would have been very serious consequences for Western interests, not only in Mali but elsewhere. Mali is a key country geostrategically. Where it is situated is extremely important to Western interests. It's a key country for the stability of the broader Sahel region. You have Mauritania, Niger, Algeria, Morocco, and other countries that depend on the stability of that country for them also to be stable. And that kind of explains maybe Algeria's reluctance to get involved in the conflict. So it would have presented a major threat, but especially in terms of security. I was at a talk a few months ago here in Parliament where the key question was, is Mali the next Afghanistan? Well, I think if the French had not intervened, we could have probably answered that question with a probably or a yes.
Yeah.
It would have become a haven for terrorist groups. Yeah.
One thing I would add, the French obviously intervened at relatively short notice. It was clear that there was going to be a foreign involvement from the ECOWAS states, probably this coming September. That was the original possibility. What isn't clear is whether the movement of the Islamist faction south was actually to have a chance of taking Bamako, or whether it was to preempt any counter move north. It's certainly, the information at the time suggested that what they were about was moving south to prevent one major airstrip being available in government hands. So it's not clear that they would have gone as far as Bamako. If they had, then I would certainly agree with my colleague.
Sir John Stanley.
You said that the jury is out as to whether the British intervention in Mali was a good decision or not so good decision. I understand entirely why you should have said that. But given we are where we are, could you both tell us what you consider should be the British government's top policy priorities as far as Mali is concerned from now on?
My own view is clearly that the main requirement is to try in the short term to see whether anything can be done to facilitate successful elections. That's going to be particularly difficult in the north, although there's some useful negotiations apparently starting between the government and some of the northern groups. In the slightly longer term, one has to address the underlying problems. As my colleague said, this is a long-term historic problem. It relates largely to the relative neglect of the north over a number of decades. So anything which can help Mali, both in the terms of promoting better governance and getting at the root of the underlying socioeconomic differences, I think would be of value. And where Britain can help, it should. It may not be a priority for Britain, but Mali is a very significant country. And if it was to really fail as a state, the consequences would be serious.
I think the UK should be commended already for what it's done in terms of helping Mali, notably in the conference that was recently held on helping the country find funds to run its state, really, because this is the major issue. I think $4 were put in by a large group of donors, and the UK provided quite a bit of assistance, I think. One major thing I would add that the UK can and should be helping out with is the issue of policing borders and intelligence sharing. And that is a key issue that is, to a certain extent, being overlooked, I think, by the French as they turn their attention towards mediating talks between the MNLA and the government, and as they focus on the Islamic insurgency. One thing the UK can do is come into the region and come into the country and talk with their Malian counterparts about sharing intelligence, providing the material to gather intelligence, to monitor the borders, to police the borders. So bringing British expertise to a country that needs specifically these key things to maintain security and to help these elections go smoothly, really.
If I could just add on the question of the 4.2 billion, that indeed is very welcome. But there is a proviso. When these kinds of pledges are made in this kind of circumstance, it's not at all uncommon for there to be double pledges, for countries basically to pledge the same money in two different votes. And then the money actually isn't delivered. So 4.2 billion as now is very good news. if it is implemented. I might say that I think it is fair to say that the British overseas development system is one of the best regarded internationally, and one hopes that that would not be a problem for Britain. In fact, I doubt that it would be. But it is a feature when you have a number of major pledges made by many countries. The amount that actually gets delivered can be very much less. We hope it's not that in this case.
On our Syrian refugees right now and the commitments that haven't been fulfilled there.
Yeah. John Barron.
You both rightly say that the jury is out on Mali, and we need to see how things progress from here. But can you just address the wider issue as to whether our involvement, the West's involvement in Mali, feeds into a wider perception of Islam being under attack as being, I mean, that concept, I mean, Al-Qaeda has been written off as a military force, yet it still remains potent in a number of reasonable parts of the Muslim world.
Yes.
And part of that narrative, a number of commentators are suggesting, is the narrative spun from, one or two Muslim stations, the media, that Islam is under attack.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think our involvement in Mali feeds into that, and is there any wider ramifications?
I think our involvement in Mali won't feed into that too strongly because our involvement is relatively small. I mean, we don't officially have any combat forces there. We have assets which certainly have aided the French in their own combat missions.
Sorry, can I qualify my question? When I say our, I mean the West's.
Oh, sorry, the West.
The West.
Well, certainly, as far as the West is concerned, yes, this will relate primarily, I think, to France at present. Yes, if you look at the entire picture across the world, one tends to forget that from a radical Islamist perspective, it is all part of a single picture. And it is absolutely correct that Al-Qaeda as a central hierarchical organised entity is hugely diminished, not least over the last 3 or 4 years because of the impact of the special forces and drone attacks in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But as a potent idea, it's a very different measure, and that goes from the Caucasus Emirate through to the Swahili coast, through to Yemen, Somalia, then parts of Western North Africa, and also preeminently at present, Iraq and Syria. There is this perception, it's a minority perception, but it's a significant one, that Islam is under the attack. It's a mirror image of the view that you get in Western quarters that Islam is the threat. But it is powerful, it is potent, and is aided a lot by the 24-hour news channels, but particularly the social media and the way propaganda can spread so very rapidly.
Yeah, I think that Western intervention in Mali will definitely be a key element now of Islamic militants, and I wouldn't focus specifically on Al-Qaeda, and I'll explain why. Narrative in the coming years, specifically Mali, but also Syria, which is now a major hotspot for recruitment, or major topic used to recruit new jihadis. But this isn't anything new. This has existed for quite some time. There's the narrative, the classic narrative that the Al-Qaeda has used, which is Bayt al-Harb and Bayt al-Salam, the house of war versus the house of peace. The house of peace being Islam, and the house of war being what comes into the house of peace. And so that narrative will not change, in my opinion. But you spoke about Al-Qaeda being diminished as a military force. But I'd say, and I would tend to agree with you, that is more and more so the case in regions like Afghanistan and elsewhere. But what we shouldn't do is forget that Al-Qaeda as an idea, or as a franchise, a business model almost, in this arc of instability, as some are calling it, which ranges from West Africa to East Africa, is still a very strong and very potent idea. And I think that will come to replace the idea of Al-Qaeda as a potent military force, is that Al-Qaeda and its agenda or its narrative is a potent franchise. So we should keep that in mind, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Can we take you back, Mr. Mesdoua, to your remarks about potential for turning into an Afghanistan? Given the internal political crisis in Mali, the coup last year, the difficulties between the north and the south that you've talked about, how easy is it going to be to turn Mali into a state that is both stable and democratic? Will it be like Afghanistan? Will it be worse?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer, but I think there are reasons to be positive. There are signs to be positive for Mali's development and Mali's construction as a stable state. But all will depend, as I said earlier, on the outcome of the elections. Actually, not necessarily the outcome, but also the process, whether or not they are free and fair. But I think the French presence will do a lot, and the international presence will do a lot to make sure that they are free and fair elections. More importantly, on the issues of identity and neglect of the North, those are going to be the key elements to creating a stable state in Mali. Negotiations between the MNLA, which are the Tuareg group, which initiated this whole sort of crisis to a certain extent in the north of Mali, and the government, the transition government, are going to be vital for Mali's development in the coming years, because it might set up the framework for political representation, but also a fair distribution of the country's wealth. And the North has been neglected in terms of infrastructure, in terms of political representation, and those issues are going to be on the table when these talks take place. But I also want to add that I think the UN presence, which is expected in the country, which will not focus on the Islamic insurgency, it will leave that to the French troops that will remain on the ground. That presence, which will secure towns, secure the roads, secure the country's territory, is going to be vital also to creating a stable state, and it's a positive sign. But again, Malian problems require Malian solutions, and it's up to the international community to now help the Malians to strengthen themselves, to take care of their own country progressively as they start finding their way politically.
So there can't be a stable situation without the MNLA being involved in the solution? I mean, how does that go with the fact that, as I understand it, in Kidal there has been an attempt to drive them out? Are they part of the solution or part of the problem, or both?
In my opinion, they're part of the solution, and some analysts will tell you they're not part of the solution. Some people in the south of the country, in Mali, will tell you they're not part of the solution. But you have to understand that tensions between Tuareg populations in the north and the south, which are mainly composed of Bambara or Fulani and Pearl populations, there is a great deal of tension and animosity between them. And part of the reason why the MNLA refused to leave Kidal or refused to hand over Kidal to the army is because they fear persecution, and they also don't want to give up some of that autonomy. It's a bargaining chip for them at the moment to hold that city. And so you have to include every key actor that's in the north. You can't just disregard a major military force that has been able to topple a state. So I think the Malians, it's in their best interest to include them in the solution, but I don't know if the professor agrees.
No, I mean, as I hope my evidence made clear, I'm not a country specialist. My evidence is more looking at the wider remit. But as far as Mali is concerned, talking to colleagues who know the country well, it is pointed out that one of the problems of recent months has been the behaviour of the Mali army elements of the forces. In fact, if you look at the Mali army and the surrounding ECOWAS states, it's generally thought that only the Chadi military groups have been really effective, and they have either withdrawn or they're going to be withdrawn. The Mali army, or elements of it, have a really bad reputation. There have been some real atrocities. There have been examples, for example, of people being killed and then thrown in wells to poison the drinking supply. In a sense, from the point of view of the Tuareg elements in particular, it's what they feared. And I think unless that can be reined in, it's going to be really quite difficult to get negotiations going. I'm not in any way saying there haven't been atrocities on the other side as well. But this is, I think, a very significant element. If you get a long-term, stable security situation, that, frankly, is not being achieved at present. And I think a lot of the success of the elections in the longer term, over the next year or two, is going to be bound up with improving the security situation.
I've got some more questions to come back about the UK role, but on this point about elections, the elections in July are presidential elections, and then there's supposed to be parliamentary election after that. Is the timetable of July firm? And I've been told that there may be a delay that it may not be necessarily July, or that the parliamentary election may be delayed to the autumn, to September. Is there a firm date for both?
There is said to be, but I don't think one should take that as read. And I mean, if one wants to be optimistic, if there are negotiations, particularly with some of the groups in the north, there may be an advantage in some delay. But the problem is that any delay can be seen as a delaying tactic to prevent improvements in governance, and that I think is the quandary.
I also, I personally feel as though the country won't be ready, logistically speaking, to have elections at the set date, which I believe is July 28th. But the French president and French authorities have been quite clear that they would like for that date to be a firm one.
So they can leave?
Not only, well, they've already started to withdraw troops,
yeah.
But more specifically, I think it is to pressure their Malian counterparts to move ahead with the political transition. One reassuring aspect of the elections that I think I should add is that the transition government, namely the president and his cabinet, have assured that they will not be running in these elections or in the parliamentary elections. And that's, I think, a very good sign for Mali.
And the election could be held in the whole of Mali, or would it be difficult to hold it in the north?
Well, it's obviously going to be difficult, in my opinion, to hold it in the north, given the situation simply in Kidal. You have an entire city that's run by the MNLA, and that's out of government hands. You have, I mean, there are French and African troops in the city, but you don't have control of the Malian government over that town, and that's just one example of the impediments to running the elections so soon. But you have other issues as well when it comes to the voter registry. I think the Malian authorities are not ready yet, and they've expressed that on several occasions, I think, in meetings behind closed doors to their French counterparts. That's not necessarily reported quite a bit in the media, but I think it's a factor that we should all consider.
Okay, can I now take you to the fact that the UK is involved? Is nation building, which is effectively what's now being undertaken, something in which we should be trying to play a leading role, or given the fact that this is a French-led operation and we are very much the junior partner in this, should we accept that we're only playing a minor role?
My personal view is we should accept that we should play a relatively minor role. If you're looking at the whole of Western North Africa, Libya and certainly Nigeria are far more important in this whole room of things. I mean, the development of Boko Haram and Ansaro in Nigeria is, in my view, a lot more significant even than what is happening in Mali. And that is where Britain has much stronger connections and probably play a better role. That doesn't mean we should not be involved in Mali, but I think relatively speaking, it is less important in the wider region.
Do you agree?
To a certain extent, not fully. I think the UK has something to offer when it comes to the transition in Mali. And
is that because we're not France?
Exactly. That's exactly why. I think the French come with quite a bit of historical baggage. There are accusations, I'm sure you've all heard, of neo-colonialism, France-Afrique as it's called. And the tendency, or the accusation that is put forward, is that the French have a tendency to get involved when their interests are at stake. Gold mines in the south of Mali, uranium mines in Niger. But I definitely think that it's in the interest of the UK to get involved. How the UK gets involved is obviously up for debate, but the UK should bring its expertise in various areas. It doesn't have to be a military contribution. It can be an assistance in development. It can be an assistance in consolidating and strengthening the capacities of the Malian state to run its everyday affairs. And I think that's something the UK is very good at, and it would be able to do it without its hands being tied because it doesn't have that historical baggage that France does.
Okay, that's helpful. Can I just finally ask about ECOWAS? You referred, Professor Rogers, to the fact that they were due to be going to Mali in September, and events moved, and as a result France had to intervene. Is this a failure of ECOWAS, that they were unable to get their act together more quickly? And what does that tell us about the future capacity of ECOWAS to deal with conflict in the Western Sahel?
It was something of a failure, but I think one has to recognise that if you look at just about all the ECOWAS states, with the possible exception of Chad, the nature of their armed forces means they're simply not trained for this kind of operation outside their own country. I mean, if you look at the very extensive training and support that you've had with African Union interventions in Somalia, where you're dealing, with armed forces such as the Kenyans and the Ugandans, who frankly have a greater capability for this, that really doesn't exist in West Africa. And I mean, one could not really anticipate even the more elite groups of the Nigerian army having any great capability in intervening in another country. So if the failure is there, it is probably a failure to look longer term, to have units available which will be able to do this. There's a huge difference between maintaining security in your own country and doing it in another country. And some people could argue that this is one of the reasons, one of the problems is we've never ever had this idea of a United Nations Emergency Peace Service, with troops always available, drawn from many different countries.
That's the Agenda for Peace, 1992.
Absolutely. I mean, supposing there was a brigade strength, a series of brigade strength units available, including some from African countries, intervention under UN Security Council agreement, that could have transformed the situation. But, efforts of 20 or 30 years to get that, and we failed so far.
Sure. I think one additional point, it's also an issue of funding for ECOWAS. There was one of the major problems in the run-up to discussions about sending troops to Mali. There wasn't a lack of political will. I think everybody was on the same page for that. But there was a lack of funds and a lack of financial clout behind most states to invest in what is a costly exercise. And even though the political will was there and Western powers had given their assurances that they would aid ECOWAS and indeed the African Union also, the funds just weren't there. That's the bottom line.
Thank you.
John Barron.
May I draw us back, if I may, from Mali and look at Mali's neighbours? As a report, as a committee, what we're trying to do is better understand, part of the report at least, better understand the struggle that's taking place with regards to extremist groups, the link with Al-Qaeda. I mean, could a sort of Mali situation occur in any of her neighbours, whether it's Niger, Chad, that? Could we have a similar sort of situation? And when you answer that question, could you just also reflect on the importance or not of the fact that the US has just established a drone base in Niger?
If I could start more generally, certainly on your last point, the drone base established in Niger is said initially to be for reconnaissance purposes, but going back to the earlier comments about how it is viewed from the other side, that is not how it will be viewed. The very idea of any kind of drone base in West Africa relating to Mali or other countries will be viewed among the radical Islamist propagandists as a gift, because they will make the immediate connection with Yemen and with Pakistan. And there are also reports that the French Air Force, which does not have these kinds of facilities at present, it's involved in several drone programs, is now thinking seriously about buying in Reapers for use in Mali and elsewhere. Britain, of course, does have the Reaper, but there are no plans to base it in West Africa. So on that particular point, I think from a Western perspective, this makes a great deal of military sense. From the other side, it's something of a propaganda gift, I'm afraid. As to your specific question, I think my colleague probably is more equipped to answer that than I, except that I would come back to the point, not directly neighbouring, but Nigeria, I think, remains hugely significant. I do hope the committee will be looking at that in its studies.
To answer your question specifically about the risk of it occurring or the Mali scenario occurring elsewhere in the region, I think that the factors or the factors that led to the crisis in Mali exist elsewhere in the region. And in some instances, in countries we don't necessarily expect, like Tunisia and Libya. But Niger and Mauritania are two particularly fragile states with fragile institutions and with similar grievances at the local level when it comes to identity. Tuareg rebellions have occurred before in Niger, for example, and so it's not a new a new issue for them. I think the leadership of these states is very cognizant of the fact that this is a threat for their own stability, and which explains even Chad's reaction, I guess, Chad's involvement, that the conflict might spill over into their territory. Another, I'd say, aggravating factor which might lead to similar crises in Niger and Mauritania, and perhaps even Burkina Faso, is the fact that these states and their institutions are under a tremendous amount of stress, having to deal now with what is actually a tremendous amount of refugees, which they are unable to cope with alone. And the free flow of peoples and arms, which is another set of factors which led to what occurred in Mali, is still there for these countries, and they're unable to deal with that. I think the US drone base is going to actually act to a certain extent at the tactical level and at the operational level as a slight deterrent for groups who freely move throughout these territories, desert territories, because a lot of groups are actually going into Libya now and using the armed stockpiles and returning to their countries or flowing through this sort of Saharan belt into countries like Chad, into as far as Sudan and Somalia. And so what that drone base can do is serve as a deterrent if it is used effectively to help states locally to police their borders.
May I press you, though, a little bit on what makes up Al-Qaeda in the region? Help us to better understand the threat, its attraction. I mean, some commentators would suggest that what Al-Qaeda tends to do is hook on to local discontent. And when you look at the religious extremists in Maghreb or the Sahel or indeed Nigeria, there seems to be a sort of common theme there. We know Al-Qaeda is not a homogenous group as such, but a collection of local factions expressing discontent in obviously very local area. How does that play here? Is that your understanding of the threat from Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups? I mean, and in which case is the answer to address the individual grievances as a way of combating the terrorist threat?
If one looks at Al-Qaeda overall and take it in its form about 10 years ago, it had two very distinctive features which are not typical of localized revolutionary movements. It is a revolutionary movement who wants revolutionary political change. It was transnational from the start, more or less. It had its origins in Afghanistan in the 1980s, but by the end of the 1980s, it was looking much more transnationally at the near enemy of the unacceptable regimes in the Middle East and the far enemy of the United States. The second point is this extraordinary and almost unique aspect as a revolutionary movement. It's eschatological, it looks beyond this life. That's the real key. You know, the elements in Al-Qaeda do not see necessarily they are achieving their aims in their own lifetime, because it is a religious ideology. It's not neo-Maoist, for example, like the Naxalites. And that, I think, is crucial to understanding the change from a more narrow, semi-hierarchical paramilitary movement to an idea. And we're dealing with timescales which may be 50 to 100 years in their view. Their idea of establishing a Middle East-wide caliphate, maybe extending to the world, is measured in 50 to 100 years or more. And so they do not follow our kind of political timescales. But that was it 10 or 12 years ago. How does that relate to now? Well, there are elements of that still. And there are elements which are it is entirely looking long-term, but the individual elements may not be transnational. So, for example, I think, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, but broadly, the more Islamist paramilitaries active in Mali are much more focused on Mali. Boko Haram is much more focused on Nigeria itself, and Saru, this offshoot of it, is more transnational, hence his kidnapping of foreigners. If you look more worldwide, there are elements of the Al-Qaeda idea in Yemen which look transnationally, hence the attempts to attack the United States. And there are elements in diasporas that are very much transnational. Whereas if you take Syria, which is the most important current area of Islamist paramilitary development, that is primarily focused on Syria. But the extraordinary thing there is the way in which it has drawn in dedicated young paramilitaries from around the region. That, I think, so there is that transnational element there. I would also very much support what my colleague said about Libya. I think we are underestimating the extent to which a very brutal Gaddafi regime suppressed Islamist dissent in Libya, which meant that many such young Libyans went overseas and got combat training. Quite a lot of them are back now. And in spite of its innate wealth, it is taking far longer for Libya to make a transition to a stable, peaceful society, and we may have some years to go yet.
To answer your question, I think that we have to view Al-Qaeda, or the rise of radical Islamism, militant Islamism in North Africa, strictly through a North African lens. And as my colleague was saying, groups like Ansar ad-Din, which are operating in Mali, are very much based on local agendas, establishing Sharia law in the north, establishing Sharia law in the country, and that might have changed if Bamako had fallen. But as far as we know, groups like Ansar ad-Din, Mujao, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, operating in northern Mali, and groups that attacked the BP and Statoil gas plant in Amenas in Algeria, Muwaqi'in bid-Dam, are also groups with that may use the internationalist jihadi narrative, but in practice are very much focused, I'd say, on local agendas. And so we have to see them through that prism. And we also need to understand that their capacity to recruit and their capacity to thrive and to operate in this region depends on local factors primarily.
So can I just be clear then, if I may press you on that? I mean, the Prime Minister has used, I'm sure he's not the only one, words such as generational struggle, which actually feeds into the jihadist narrative quite nicely. I mean, how do we then address the extremists in the region? Are you suggesting that you could do it, on an individual basis, address each local grievance? Because I suggest that's not perhaps the answer, but, how do we address what the Prime Minister has described as the poisonous narrative that religious extremists feed on?
Well, they may be groups that have a regional and local focus, but the space in which they operate and their capacity to thrive depends on, as I was mentioning earlier, not only the weakness of states in which they operate, but also on the capacity to move freely through the Sahara. And so we're actually talking about groups with local identities, but that are actually transnational threats, which require, and I would tend to agree with the Prime Minister's view on this, which require a transnational solution. This isn't something that we can address just locally in an isolated context, but we have to understand it from a local perspective. We have to view it from the perspective of local grievances. And we also shouldn't disregard, we tend to talk about this strictly from the point of view of Islamist ideologies, but I would also tend to focus on the economic incentive these groups have. A lot of them are smugglers, criminals, bandits that have reconverted or have used this franchise, this Al-Qaeda model, to expand. So we have to look at the economic agenda that they push forward, which is one of economic predation above all. And that requires a transnational solution, not just...
So if you had a hit list of things that you would want to address in the region to lessen the link of local grievances and extremists with Al-Qaeda, addressing the economics and poverty and so forth would obviously be high on that. Closing down large ungoverned spaces would probably, as best you can, be top. What else should be part of the mix? Well, how should the West respond, in other words, to these threats?
Well, I think certainly there are two elements in which the economic aspect is important. One is, as my colleague was saying, the criminality, and one can't underestimate the importance of some West African states, Guinea-Bissau through to Mali and others, in terms of the drug use, primarily South American drugs, the route through into Europe. It's hugely important, and it is very profitable. But the other economic element, as we alluded to earlier on, was the relative neglect of the North, the socioeconomic divide. And I think that is a fundamental thing which you find in many areas where you get this kind of radical movement developing. Terrorism does not come from the poorest of the poor. Let's be clear about that. But I think relative deprivation is a different matter. The perception that you are relatively more poor than another group. And given the huge improvements in education and literacy of the last 40 years, that's a much more common factor. Goes a long way to explaining some of the neo-Maoist rebellions, particularly the Naxalites in India. So I think one has to really go beyond the immediate threat and always avoid the risk of seeing it purely as a radical religious threat, and see what lies behind the motives of people even falling back on that part of their identity.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'd add one more nuance to that, and to say that there is a difference, in my opinion, between the radicalization of, say, youth in Mali, in the north of Mali, or elsewhere in West Africa, to the radicalization of youth which is currently occurring in North Africa, which is, say, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, where you have the rise, and a very worrying rise, of Salafi groups with pretensions, I'd say, towards armed conflict, or with a willingness to engage in that. So there are differences. In the north of Mali, I would say there is more an issue to do. It is more an issue of development, but also of policing. Whereas in other countries, perhaps in North Africa, the issues are more deep-rooted in marginalization, political repression, and obviously unemployment, which is perhaps the key word to cutting off recruitment methods and recruitment possibilities for these groups.
Okay, thanks.
I saw one figure. I can't give you a reference for it now, but I think it's correct that Tunisia, with a population of 10 million people, has 140,000 unemployed graduates. It's a very large group of educated people on the margins. And if we go back, I think this is relevant, in the 1990s in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi economy dipped somewhat because of lower oil prices. That meant that there were far more, tens of thousands of young men coming out of the technical schools and the high schools into an economy with relatively little employment, unless maybe they had a connection with one of the 1,000 princely families. That again is from where you can get a kind of conviction that there must be another more radical way, and it's very easy for the radicalizers to have an effect in that sort of population.
Okay, thank you very much.
Professor, do you think population growth, a high level of population growth, is a factor here?
Across the region, it's probably the one region of the world where the demographic transition is still relatively slow. I mean, population growth is far less significant than 20 years ago, say in Latin America or Southern Africa or much of South and Southeast Asia, with some exceptions. But what you have across much of the Middle East is this demographic bulge. The birth rates are falling, but you still have a very large proportion of the population aged between about 5 and 25. Far better educated than in the past, because there have been improvements, with far less employment prospects. I think this demographic bulge, combined with the economic divide, lies at a lot of the heart of what my colleague was saying, the development of more radical groups in Egypt and elsewhere. The problem is that as Egypt makes a transition to what we hope is more democratic governance, whatever form of governance has an incredible task ahead of it at a time of, world economic recession and all these internal problems.
I mean, you say that population growth rates are falling, and Nigeria is going to see their population nearly quadruple by 2050.
There are exceptions. I say the exceptions across that belt.
It's patchy.
It is very patchy, but I think the point is that across the Middle East, and I'm more familiar personally with Iran, I have this huge proportion of younger people coming through, really quite well educated. This demographic bulge is still to run. And I think this goes to explain, for example, the very high levels of graduate unemployment in Tunisia.
If I may just add one point, I think another key factor that we tend to overlook, which is essential in all of this, is urbanization, explosive urbanization, and which actually feeds into relative deprivation. The idea that you have large numbers of people, and I'll give you the example of my own home country, Algeria, which migrate from the smaller cities and villages into the major cities, Algiers, Oran, Annaba, and this is the same case in Tunisia and Libya, I'd say, and Morocco also. But once they reach there with the hope of finding a job, of being educated, of finding housing, once they find a housing crisis, rampant unemployment, you have people living, 12, 15 people living in houses that are made for 2 people. All of all the unintended consequences which come with rapid urbanization and which are out of the control of governments in the region. And again, this is North Africa specifically, not necessarily West Africa. But all of this contributes, and there has been research to show this, contributes quite substantially, I'd say, or has contributed to the expansion and the rise of radical youth in these countries.
Thank you. Mark Henry.
I'd just like to pursue the economic aspects to this as well, and how they play into the ideological aspects, but also the way in which criminality is involved. Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb has made millions and millions of dollars, mainly from smuggling, but also kidnapping. The French government in the past has paid ransom money for the release of French citizens. How important is that supply of money from smuggling and kidnapping to the extremists in the region? And if we can cut off that money, would it make it safer?
If I may start very briefly, I think in that region is the key phrase, it is relatively more important than elsewhere. I think you find that across the activities of groups that generally are under the sort of the banner of Al-Qaeda across the Middle East, then apart from Afghanistan with a huge income from opium in the past, if I can include the Taliban very loosely in this category, I know they're not part of the Al-Qaeda group. If you look right across the Middle East, by and large, I think away from the Maghreb, the elements of criminality and kidnapping are not so dominant as sources of funding. But my understanding is that it is much more important in this region, but you may like to comment on that.
Again, we'd have to look at regional specificities. In West Africa, I think it is important to cut off that source of funding. Every little bit helps. Groups such as Mujao, and I'll take the example of Mujao, rose to prominence, particularly because they were able to get money from hostage-taking and kidnapping of Western foreign aid workers, for example, in refugee camps in Algeria, in the Western Sahrawi refugee camps. And so cutting off that source of funding is vital. More importantly, it's an essential way it's a deterrent to make sure that these groups do not, it shouldn't serve as an example for them to keep kidnapping Western or other hostages. But I would tend to agree that in North Africa, this isn't the prominent, or in the Maghreb, it isn't the key source of funding. We have to look at other more complex sources of funding, particularly emanating from very wealthy individuals and organizations in the Gulf, as well as states that are funding groups. And you have a very complex network, a whole spider web of terrorist funding networks which operate more prominently in North Africa. But that's different to the Sahel.
And what practical steps do you think we in the UK could take with international partners to cut off the flow? I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the French are actively paying ransoms. Now, that isn't a deterrent, that's an encouragement. What do you think needs to be done to cut off the flow of the finance?
Well, I think greater transparency, and encouraging states, particularly Gulf states, to first of all police this kind of these banking transactions that go relatively unnoticed. A lot of them actually take they take different shapes and sizes. These funds, they can be investments, they can be made through local business ventures and business partnerships, and really they fall under the radar, and so that's going to be very difficult. But I think the UK can put pressure on states to monitor these things and to increase transparency. Just to go back to the hostage taking and the kidnapping and paying ransoms, I think that policy is changing in France. François Hollande has sort of well, at least rhetorically speaking, the narrative has changed to say France does not negotiate with terrorists and France will not pay ransom money. That might be the case. I mean, the French might be paying ransom money without saying that they are, but at least the narrative has changed. And I think the UK should stick to its policy of not negotiating with terrorists. I think it's the best solution to protect British interests.
But on the other aspect of funding, particularly through the drugs trade, including a very large trade in illicit tobacco, there you have the problem of a demand in the receiving countries, including in terms of cocaine, Western Europe. And I mean, it's the same problem with the drugs trade as a whole. Do you try and cut it off at source? Do you try and interdict it? Or do you actually have different policies as far as the recipient countries where there actually is a demand? And I think that applies as much to how we deal with things in West Africa as it does in relation to South America.
We've seen the trigger of thousands of Tuareg fighters that Libya had recruited in the 1990s, going back into Mali. Some people are calling it in Libya a post-blowback with the French coming in and pushing the Tuareg back further north and into Libya. What part, if any, do you feel that the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, what part has that played in bringing the forces that put Mali under threat and obviously necessitated the movement of the French into Mali?
Within Libya itself, there is now a stronger element of Islamist-orientated militias than existed in the population 5 years ago under Gaddafi, where there was pretty tight repression of this kind of outlook. So you have that anyway, and then you have the transnational element, and that relates, as you say, very much to the Tuareg who were part of the Libyan armed forces. There is certainly, therefore, a double blowback. Within Libya itself, you have a stronger Islamist element because of the lack of control of what was a very repressive regime. But you also have the blowback in terms of blowing back first into Mali and then possibly back into Libya. I think it again relates to this issue of almost completely permeable borders. We're not seeing a set of geographical entities. We're seeing an entire region with extraordinary abilities for people to flow across borders and no real policing of borders in most cases.
I'd also say that what contributed to a large extent was, the availability of arms. And I think a lot of militias were able to use the arms that were at their disposal immediately after the revolution and during the revolution to either achieve local objectives, which they're now sort of parading actually in the north of the country, and showing, they utilize these weapons now as a show of strength to maintain control over their respective territories. But also those arms obviously served the Tuareg who were able to come. Libya became an arms bazaar in the aftermath of the revolution because of the borders, because there was a lack of central government authority over regions that are difficult to control in the kind of unstable situation that came after the revolution. So one thing I would say is that the demise of the Gaddafi regime, the fall of the Gaddafi regime, contributed, but was not necessarily the sole causal factor behind what the Malian crisis. The seeds for the Malian crisis were there anyways. I would say it was just an aggravating factor.
When you say aggravating, would you say it was perhaps an accelerating factor? Because and do you think that perhaps Britain and France, in its zeal to see the removal of Gaddafi to help the opposition, perhaps overlooked the fact that it would have this impact on Mali?
Yeah, I think it's the law of unintended consequences. Arming the rebels might have seemed in the short term as a good policy in the specific context of Libya. But the problem and the reality, I think the reality in this region, as I mentioned earlier, is that any decision at the local level in one state will affect the other state because of the very geographic nature, because of the geostrategic and geopolitical factors in that region. The fact that the borders are so porous means that if you're about to inject, or if you do inject, a certain quantity of arms or fighters or a certain set of new political realities in one given political landscape, it will have an immediate effect on a country nearby. And it just so happened that Mali had the ingredients, or had the sort of the seeds were planted for the crisis to be accelerated, as you said.
I think we can see that in hindsight. What my question was, do you think that should have been foreseen by Britain and France?
I think it could have been foreseen, yes. I think it could have been foreseen, but it doesn't mean, I don't think the intention was there.
No.
I think in trying to assist one country to achieve what were very noble objectives in the short term, people maybe, or policymakers, decision makers, did not necessarily look at what possible consequences could have come out of that.
That's my point. I'm sure it wasn't Britain and France's intention to cause the problems we've seen in Mali. Professor Rogers, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I mean, if you look more broadly, at the time of the termination of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, there were people warning against long-term consequences. There were much stronger analytical voices warning against the consequences of terminating the Saddam Hussein regime. And there were a few people who were rather concerned about how Libya would turn out, whatever the rightful motives. There's a certain irony here in that when Gaddafi came in from the cold, 7 or so years ago, for about 5 years Libya went on quite a decent arms buying spree, mainly from European countries. Indeed, just a week before the French and American intervention started, you actually had one French company upgrading the Libyan Air Force Mirages, and you had an Italian company upgrading some of the army's equipment. And this meant that, in a sense, the level of equipment among the Libyan armed forces had been improved since Gaddafi came in from the cold. And some of that equipment has been of use now to people who have gone through to Mali. So that's an unexpected consequence, I'm afraid. Again, perhaps it could have been foreseen. I'm bound to say, I think the people who were warning about the likely outcome in Afghanistan and Iraq were more prominent than people who were rather more cautious. I mean, in broad terms, as far as Western countries are concerned, there was a lot of support for the French-led intervention in Libya. But even so, I think it's been very disappointing to see the consequences and the state of the country now, as I said, in spite of the fact that it is inherently a pretty wealthy country.
Mr. Mesdoua, you're originally from Algeria, and Algeria appears to at least have avoided many of the repercussions of the Arab Spring and obviously seems to be quite politically stable. Do you think it's as stable as it appears?
It is. It is a country that shows signs of stability, and that's important for this region at the moment. I think for Western powers looking to find some kind of anchor in the region. It's at the macroeconomic level, the country is stable because of its large revenue, which comes from oil and gas exports. Politically, it's a country which is stable because you have a sort of system that has cemented itself following what was a very deadly and very tragic civil war throughout the 90s, which cost the lives of 200,000 Algerians. And so part of the reason why Algeria, one of many reasons why Algeria was able to sort of avoid or remain immune to the Arab Spring, I don't necessarily like those terms, but was because the country had already gone through an Arab Spring. A lot of people set the start date for the Arab Spring in Tunisia and the Jasmine Revolution, but in Algeria, people very much consider it to have started in the late 80s, in 1988, with the Berber Spring. So Algeria considers itself to be a stable country, and I think throughout the crisis in Mali, it really wanted to give that image of a nation that could be a stable partner for European powers. That said, I think the country does have quite a few factors, a lot of the ingredients that existed in Tunisia and in Egypt and in Libya and elsewhere in the Arab world, where the Arab Spring did take place. You do have unemployment, you do have a housing crisis, you do have a political system which has sort of failed in many ways to regenerate itself, bringing in more youth post-revolutionary youth into the system. And so you do have those ingredients. But the system cannot be compared to the regimes of Ben Ali or the regimes of Mubarak or the regimes of Gaddafi. You still have enough space, as it were, in the political arena to operate, and so that's helped the country to remain relatively stable.
Are you saying that's not, because of that, maybe young people haven't radicalised as much as they have in other countries?
Well, Algeria did peak in terms of radicalization throughout the 90s. I mean, a lot of the groups that you see and a lot of the leaders of the groups that you currently see in Mali operating find their roots in the Algerian civil war. The key leaders of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb itself is an offshoot of the GSPC, which is a group, and the GIA, which is a group, which are groups that operated in Algeria. Abdelmalik Durukdel, who is the head and the emir of the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, is also... All of these groups and the names and these leaders are known quantities to the Algerian authorities and security forces. So the country has already experienced this peak of radicalization, and society has sort of... And it's sort of fizzled out in societies. Islamists no longer have a foothold in society because they've been to a certain extent delegitimized by the civil wars and fragmented as political entities following that civil war.
If I could very briefly move to the west, because I think Morocco is a very interesting case. Leaving aside all the controversy over its control of Western Sahara, what you have seen there is Mohammed VI has speeded up the rate of reform in the light of the experience of the Arab awakening. And that so far, maybe fingers crossed, has meant you've not seen the kind of problems in Tunisia and Egypt reflected in what's happened in Morocco. I'm bound to say that the same is not necessarily true for Jordan, where I think analysts are far more concerned that there could be a sudden upsurge against King Abdullah.
You see Morocco as fairly stable?
Relatively stable, yes. I mean, to be fair, the present king was already more reformist, and as I understand it, the monarchy in Morocco is held in higher regard than, say, the equivalent monarchy in Jordan. But essentially, the rate of reform was speeded up, really in the light of events in Tunisia and Egypt. And so far, that I think has meant there is a stability. There are still the underlying economic problems, the problems of educated people on the margins, and the other problem with the relationship with Western Sahara. But so far, I think Morocco is a case where indirectly the Arab awakening has actually had an effect which people perhaps don't fully recognise. I don't know what you would... Maybe a difference.
Briefly, we'll go around.
I agree to a certain extent, but I would warn the committee about the issue of Western Sahara and dismissing the issue of Western Sahara as an issue which doesn't somehow require any kind of...
No, I would agree with that.
I think it's really important. It's an issue which really needs to be addressed, because in that what is considered a low-level conflict actually has the potential of escalating, given demographics, given the fact that the status quo has not addressed any kind of political solution, which is necessary. The Sahrawi youth that are currently in the refugee camps in Algeria are threatened by the prospect of radicalization, because they feel as though the Polisario, the government in exile, has failed by maintaining the status quo and peace with Morocco, by maintaining talks with Morocco and without engaging in an armed struggle, that government has failed them. And you do have a prospect of youth taking up what is a Sahrawi intifada of sorts, or even joining some of the groups that are in Mali. The geographical proximity is there. And so the last thing I think we want is to see Sahrawi youth engaging in criminal activities in the north of Mali, or engaging in a full-on armed intifada when the option for a political solution and a negotiated solution with Morocco is on the table. So I would encourage the committee to...
This has been going on for 38 years.
Exactly.
The final question, can we just go back to Algeria for a second? Do you think the attack on the In Amenas refinery actually indicates that Algeria's grip on the security situation perhaps is not quite as strong as you might think?
Yes and no. The gas plants and the oil facilities in the south of the country remained a sort of fortress throughout the 90s, even at the peak of violence and the peak of the civil war. And Algerian authorities and security forces were very, very good at maintaining the security at those facilities. But a lot of the factors that existed throughout the 90s have been greatly altered by what's going on now in Libya, and I think the what explains the Algerian security forces' reaction in Amenas, which was a strong reaction, a very forceful reaction, was them setting a message sending a message to other Islamist groups in the region to not replicate the same thing. It's very difficult, I think, and this is me speaking from a personal perspective, it's very difficult to maintain full security in these facilities in the current climate, in the current context. We're dealing with a very mobile, very fluid threat. So full security will never be entirely guaranteed. But I think In Amenas really became a sort of wake-up call for Algerian security forces that they needed to review, along with Western companies operating in their country, the whole set of security dispositions and the apparatus that was in place.
It was exactly the same thing with the Saudis 7 years ago when you had the attack on the Abqaiq oil processing plant near Restanura.
Yeah.
That more or less failed, but it led to the Saudis putting tens of thousands more security people into the oil facilities.
Can I thank you both very much? It's been a really helpful session to us, and your sparing your time is very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sitting suspended while we quickly change the witnesses over.